Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
I'm all right. I swear it's always a big news day whenever I'm co-hosting with you, Michael. Do you ever think about saving something for a different co-host?
Well, there's actually, there's a logic to this, isn't it? Which is we're the Monday show. We mop up all of Saturday, all of Sunday, and then Monday. That's why we put you in for this day, because we know it's the most important show of the week, Ash. We do have some big stories for you guys today. Tory leadership contender Kemi Badenoch has caused a stir with comments around maternity pay. The last ever coal power plant in Britain has shut down. Of course, though, we will be spending the first half of the show talking about Israel and Lebanon. Israel has told the United States it is planning a limited ground operation in Lebanon that could start imminently. That's according to the Washington Post. The threat, of course, comes as the Middle East is reeling from Israel's assassination of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah. Nasrallah was killed on Friday in an Israeli air raid in southern Beirut. US-made 2,000-pound bombs were used to destroy 4 residential tower blocks and the underground compound beneath them. Hassan Nasrallah had led Hezbollah for 3 decades, when he commanded the organization's estimated 60,000 troops and 150,000 Iranian-supplied rockets, a capacity which eclipses Lebanon's national army. And Hezbollah is not just an army, it also functions as a state within a state, running schools, clinics, scout troops, and telecoms networks. But central to its ideology is resistance to Israel. Hezbollah and the IDF have been exchanging fire on their shared border since October the 8th. And on Saturday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu celebrated Nasrallah's death.
If someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. The state of Israel killed yesterday Hassan Nasrallah, the arch murderer. We settled the score with the person who's responsible for the killing and assassination of so many Israelis and many people of other nationalities, including dozens of Americans and French people. He wasn't just another terrorist, he was the terrorist.
Those words were echoed by leaders in Washington. Joe Biden released a statement calling Nasrallah's death a measure of justice. Kamala Harris called him a terrorist with American blood on his hands. But the operation to kill Nasrallah, which followed a week of attacks on Hezbollah targets, including by the detonation of thousands of pagers, has created a humanitarian crisis. The Lebanese government says 1 million people are now displaced in the country. Remember, Lebanon only has a population of 7 million, so that's 1 in 7 people. And the BBC has broadcast this report from Bekaa Valley, east of Beirut.
Israel keeps hitting hard. For now, it looks unstoppable. This is the Bekaa Valley this afternoon. There were at least 30 airstrikes in an hour. Danger in every direction. And new dead. Our neighbours, the Jamil family, are all gone, he says. As more airstrikes rain down, Noor Moussaoui lies in intensive care. She is 6 years old and was injured on her own doorstep on Monday. Her family say she's intelligent and chatty and loves meeting new people. But here, shortly before the attack, she was afraid and praying. Her mother, Rima, now prays by her bedside. And suddenly, as we filmed, the planes were back. Well, within the last few seconds, we've had a strike. We heard the plane in the air, then we felt the impact. The windows here shook, they rattled. And it's an indication of how nowhere here is safe.
Israel has continued its bombardments today. 45 people are reported to have been killed by an Israeli airstrike in the southern Lebanese town of Ain Deleb. And in the early hours of this morning, Israel struck central Beirut. That was for the first time since 2006. So Nasrallah was killed in southern Beirut. The targets there in central Beirut were 3 senior figures in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. They're a left-wing faction associated with high-profile aircraft hijackings in the 1970s. Their military and security commanders were both killed. Meanwhile, Hezbollah's deputy leader has become the first senior figure in the organization to give a public address since Nasrallah's death.
We will face any probability or possibility, and we are quite ready. If the Israelis wanted ground incursion, the resistance forces are ready for that. We have prepared, we are ready, we depend on Allah Almighty, and we are sure that the Israeli enemy will never achieve its goals. We will be victorious end of the day.
Later in the afternoon, Israel's defense minister said this: the next stage in the war against Hezbollah will begin soon, and we will do this. And as I said here a month ago, that we will shift the center of gravity to the north, this is what I say now. We will change the situation and return the residents home. Residents there being the 60,000 Israelis who have been evacuated from northern Israel since October the 7th because of those rockets from Hezbollah. So both Hezbollah and Israel are sounding defiant, though Hezbollah have certainly taken much bigger hits in this round of fighting. Earlier today, I spoke to Madi Zaidan, a doctoral researcher at King's College London who writes on the political economy of the Middle East. Madi is from southern Lebanon and a co-founder of the Accountability Archive, which documents genocidal statements made against Palestinians in the media. I began by asking him about the significance of Nasrallah's death.
The killing of Hassan Nasrallah is extremely significant. He's one of those politicians that has been present since the end of the civil war in Lebanon in the 1990s. He's not only a political leader, he's also considered a spiritual leader. He's considered very charismatic, and he's one of those politicians whereby Lebanese people of all persuasions will have at least one nice thing to say about, whether he's honest. Some people describe him as a nationalist, but really he just, his main contribution has been providing a dignified voice for the Shia population of Lebanon, a voice that is recognized internationally, and a representation of a military force that's not to be reckoned with, at least until recently. And his assassination really signifies an end to an era, to Hezbollah, because he's been their leader, or at least their representative to the outer world for the past 34 years, since the assassination of the previous leader in 1992. And so just from the amount of time he spent, forgetting about his characteristics as a person, it's bound to change Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is the most powerful political party in a country where most institutions are quite weak, where most political parties have very little popularity, have very little political purchase, and they are the most well-armed militia and political party, not just in Lebanon, but the entire region. So the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah is bound to have considerable ramifications.
Could you speak about the experience of your family? I know you're from southern Lebanon. As far as I understand, they've fled southern Lebanon to Beirut. I mean, what are they going through at the moment?
My family is currently reasonably safe. They're in Beirut. But getting to Beirut was the difficult part. And usually a trip from Sur, Tyre, my hometown, to Beirut takes around 2 hours on the worst of days. On last Monday, when my family left, it took them 8 hours. They were stuck for most of the day in traffic because so many people left after the first day of escalation. And the worst part, in addition to the long length of time, no one likes being in a car, is that the airstrikes were happening on both sides of the highway as people were fleeing. So you're able to see buildings being bombed. You're able to see, smoke in the distance. And part of you would think this could be me next. But people did make it out. My family did make it out safely. My uncle spent 16 hours. He was stuck overnight because the car died down. Several people, have no options that my family have. everyone is huddled up together in a dorm in Beirut that my brother is renting. But for the rest of the people of the south, they're staying in public schools that have been closed down. All education across the southern part of Lebanon and the Bekaa in the east, and Beirut, and parts of the southern area of Beirut, Dahi, have been closed down and reopened only for refugees. So it's really intense for everyone. And it's particularly intense for people who have just been displaced into Beirut and into areas that are currently being bombed again by Israel. And so, yeah, I mean, me personally, I have been through the 2006 war. That was only 1 month. It was a lot easier than what my family is going through now. But every single member of my family, they mark their years, their birthdays with either an Israeli invasion or an Israeli attack or a massacre. I was born 1 year after, or 1 year before the Kana massacre, and my first birthday is marked by that massacre of 100 people in a UN compound in South Lebanon, a UN compound that was hosting internally displaced people. And so all of my memories are attached to some Israeli war crime or another. The most tragic part is that you think people like my sister, my cousins, the younger generation, that they've somehow escaped this cycle of violence. And then you realize that this is really part of everyone will have a mark left on them by Israel and by the war.
If we do see sort of the degradation of Hezbollah and its sort of decline as a fighting force, maybe even as a political organization, what impacts could that have on Lebanon? I mean, I've seen, obviously it's a really confusing situation in Lebanon. It's difficult to map on sort of the politics of a country like UK to there, because you've got the state, then you've got Hezbollah, which is sort of part of the state, it's sort of not. Some people suggesting, well, if Hezbollah are weakened, then the centralized Lebanese state can reassert control and therefore maybe make more of a, make it more stable. Other people saying, well, if Hezbollah collapsed, then the entire state could collapse. I mean, where do you sort of stand on that question?
There is no telling of what will happen in the future. What we can only see is look at the past and see what's happened then. Hezbollah and various groups that are now in power came into being at a time when the Lebanese state was very weak. Historically, the Lebanese state has always been a sort of what academics call a merchant republic, a really neoliberal, pro-trade, not really investing in any infrastructure sort of state. And this has really created a lot of deprivation, a lot of poverty across most of Lebanon. And it was in that context of really extreme poverty and the war with Israel that Hezbollah came into being. So if you want to imagine Lebanon without Hezbollah, you have to imagine Lebanon again being ruled by elites who want to drive a weak state. And that would only create further conditions for new militias and new groups to come to take power. Because, people always organized in deprivation. There's no such thing as, a society that just eats itself up in the absence of a state. People build political power outside the state when it's absent. And in the chaos of war and poverty, there'll always be groups like Hezbollah that will come into being, that will hold up the values that the Lebanese people have, and they will also fight against injustice. And so it's really hard to imagine. But yeah, when there is no state, people will take radical actions to, organize collectively, and youth things will come into being. I mean, if you have to also remember, Hezbollah came into being after the Palestinian liberation. After Palestinian liberation forces left Lebanon in 1983. So the second that the Palestinians were expelled by the Israelis, Hezbollah came into being and took up the mantle of resistance. So I don't imagine that what we'll have is just a swift expulsion of any anti-resistance forces or pro-resistance forces from Lebanon. That sentiment is still there. Part of Lebanon is still occupied by Israel. And almost 60% of Lebanese people, maybe more, sympathize deeply with the Palestinian people. You can't wish that away. You can't kill the leader of a sentiment that exists, and that if that motivation remains, so will a future resistance.
That was Mahdi Zaidan speaking to me earlier today. I mean, I thought that point about how Hezbollah emerged was really interesting. So in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to kick the PLO out, so the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They were successful at that, so that would be another situation where they say, we've won, we've kicked the PLO out. Oh, but then what happened? Hezbollah emerged to carry the mantle for pro-Palestinian resistance. Oh, and guess what? They were actually more effective than the PLO because they were better armed, etc. Ash, interesting situation. I mean, super dramatic, taking out Nasrallah. I mean, it's clearly a huge short-term boost for Netanyahu. Is there, though, an obvious long-term strategy?
Well, I think there is a long-term strategy. Now, there are two ways of looking at the fact that Israel at the moment is embroiled in wars on multiple fronts at once. So the genocidal war in Gaza, upholding a system of occupation and apartheid in the West Bank, attacking Houthi targets in Yemen, and of course now being poised on the brink of a ground invasion of Lebanon. Now, there's one way of looking at this, and you hear this from the likes of Vincent Bevins, which is if you are to look back through history and you look at the South African state in the final years of apartheid attacking their neighbours and trying to overthrow governments of their neighbours, and it didn't work. Apartheid fell. And I think that that's where lots of people on the left are drawing much of their analysis from. There's also another way of looking at everything that's happened in the past year, because we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of October 7th and the consequential war on Gaza. And I think that undeniably it was a massive inflection point. It wasn't the beginning of Israel's history of violence in the region, not by a long shot, but definitely an inflection point. And I think that it's fair to say that Hamas's ability to operate has been significantly curtailed. The latest information from Gaza indicates that the IDF have effectively cut off Hamas operatives from the south of Gaza from Hamas operatives in the north. They're very, very tightly squeezed in. What we've seen with the pager attack and the bombings in Lebanon is that much of Hezbollah's leadership has been killed. That will take a long time for the movement to recover from, even though they are very interested in building up leadership within the organization. That's still a lot to recover from. And just to say that just because these strikes have been intelligence-led, that doesn't mean they're surgical strikes by any means whatsoever. The bombings, which killed Hassan Nasrallah, also destroyed 4 other buildings in very, very densely populated Beirut. But I think that way of looking at the severe impairment of the capacity of Hamas and Hezbollah since last year sort of indicates that Israel's long-term goal is to really hurt the ability for Iran to wield influence that far west via what some call proxies, what the West call proxies, what Iran calls the axis of resistance. That's been a big part of Iran's strategy for the last decade or so, that you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, and you have the Houthis all sort of keeping Israel a bit bogged down and tied in. Since Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the rules of the game for Israel changed. It set off this sort of escalatory bomb for them, where they were sort of able to sweep these actors off the field or really, really ramp up the violence. So I think that the long-term strategy for Israel very much is to curtail or even incapacitate the ability of Iran to wield influence through arming allied militaries that far west. I was reading a piece in the FT over the weekend, which was quite interesting, which sort of pointed out that, for Hezbollah, its penetration by Israeli intelligence really was a result of Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian civil war, fighting on the side of Bashar al-Assad and also Russia. it was a massive operation for Hezbollah. So it required a huge increase in the number of available fighters, and it also brought them into contact with networks who had already been compromised by American and Israeli intelligence. And so this bit of analysis sort of suggests that you've got two things going on at once. The first was obviously the way in which October 7th, for Israel, from Israel's perspective, changed all the rules. And also this other aspect, which is that Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian civil war was a moment of being really, really overstretched. So I think that that's an interesting contrast of analyses for me, and I'm not sure entirely where I stand. Is Israel's multi-front war the last gasp of a dying regime, or one that's on the way out, or is this, if you're just looking at it in terms of the geopolitics, actually it represents some successes in Israel's strategy, in that they've been able to drive that network of Iranian influence through its proxies way, way, way back.
There is also an extent in which, it's is it right to say sort of they called Iran's bluff? That's not really what I mean to say, but what I'm getting at here is, what we've been talking about on this show for more than a year now. And this has been sort of the case geopolitically for more than a decade, is that Iran sort of is supposed to have its defense. It defends its own sort of sovereignty and independence via having these proxies that can hurt Israel or sort of intervene in the region more generally. So Israel presumably, has a better equipped military than Iran, but Iran has Hezbollah, who can make life very difficult for Israel. These proxies that are somewhat independent, somewhat related, who can sort of exert a deterring force to stop Israel sort of directly intervening in Iran or elsewhere. And it seems like the deterrent that Hezbollah, was supposed to represent hasn't really shown itself to be as strong as some people imagine. Now, I might be completely proved wrong. It might be that sort of in the coming days and weeks, we see a massive retaliation. But the idea I sort of had in my head before the last week or so was that Hezbollah had a lot of long-range missiles that could do serious damage to Israel and they wouldn't be able to defend themselves from. And that meant that there were rules of the game that Israel was not keen to cross. And if there had been rules of the game, it seems like Netanyahu's crossed all of them. And I don't mean here sort of international law, because I don't think Netanyahu's ever been interested in that. I mean sort of in terms of the strategic to and fro of we do this, you do that, mutually assured destruction is sort of the obvious sort of key example of how this plays out. It doesn't have to be a moral thing, but it's to say, we only go this far because we don't want you to retaliate like that. Israel seems like they've gone very far and the retaliation has been fairly minor. Let's look at what the Arab nations are saying. Israel likes to justify its interventions in neighboring countries by repeating that it lives in a hostile neighborhood. At the UN on Friday, the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi responded.
The Israeli Prime Minister came here today and said that Israel is surrounded by those who want to destroy it, an enemy. We're here, members of a Muslim Arab committee mandated by 57 Arab and Muslim countries. And I can tell you here, very unequivocally, all of us are willing to, right now, guarantee the security of Israel in the context of Israel ending the occupation and allowing for the emergence of a Palestinian state, independent state, along the reference that we all agree. He is creating that danger because he simply does not want the two-state solution. And if he does not want the two-state solution, can you ask the Israeli officials, what is their end game? Other than just wars and wars and wars. I'm telling you, all of us in the Arab world here, we want a peace in which Israel lives in peace and security, accepted, normalized with all Arab countries in the context of ending the occupation, withdrawing from Arab territory, allowing for the emergence of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state on June 4, 1967, lies with occupied Jerusalem as capital. That is our narrative. That is, and we will guarantee Israel's security in that context. Can you ask Israelis what's their narrative other than I'm going to continue to go to war, I'm going to kill this and kill that and destroy this and this that? The amount of damage that Israeli government has done, 30 years of efforts to convince people that peace is possible, this Israeli government killed it. The amount of dehumanization, hatred, bitterness will take generations to navigate to navigate through. So ultimately, the question is, we want peace, and we've laid out a plan for peace. Ask any Israeli official, what is their plan for peace? You'll get nothing, because they're only thinking of the first step. We're going to go destroy Gaza, inflame the West Bank, destroy Lebanon, and after that, they have no plan. We have a plan. We have no partner for peace in Israel. There is a partner for peace in the Arab world.
And I think that's really persuasively put, right? Because, some people say you can't kill an idea, right? And you can kill an idea, right? In certain circumstances. So sort of the Tamil liberation movement in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers, they were basically just destroyed by a completely brutal military campaign by the government there, like trampled over human rights. It was an atrocity, basically. But they did get rid of the movement for the liberation of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. Israel seems to want to do a similar thing. It's sort of saying, we're not going to negotiate with anyone. We are just going to use our military force to take out whoever stands in the way of our sort of total domination and greater Israel, etc. But there are so many countries where the population hate them because they haven't agreed to a two-state solution. And it does seem like if they don't at some point agree to some form of Palestinian state, then, okay, so they pacify. I mean, this is unlikely anyway, but say they do manage to sort of defeat Hezbollah and install some friendly government in Lebanon. What happens then if there's an uprising in Jordan and the government, which is relatively friendly to Israel, there falls, and then you get a much more a government which is much more hardline in its defense of the Palestinians, right? You've got so many Arab states, you can't sort of hope to, which seems to be what Israel sort of tries to do, is hope to sort of directly intervene in their politics so that no one powerful enough and anti-Israel enough can come to power, even though the populations hate Israel because they continue to oppress the Palestinians. So it's the short-term sort of, clearly Israel have been very effective over the past week or so at degrading Hezbollah's military capabilities. But what is the long-term strategy? Every time a movement arises, which it will keep doing because all of your neighbors, the general populations, hate you, you're just going to then try and take out their leaders, because just endless war in that case. And if their strategy is endless war, fine, if that's what they want to do. But why are the West supporting a country whose strategy only makes sense if you look at it in terms of endless war? That was the message then from Arab leaders. But this afternoon, Netanyahu had a message for a different audience, the people of Iran.
Every day, you see a regime that subjugates you make fiery speeches about defending Lebanon, defending Gaza. Yet every day, that regime plunges our region deeper into darkness and deeper into war. Every day, their puppets are eliminated. Ask Mohammed Deif. Ask Nasrallah. There is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach. There's nowhere we will not go to protect our people and protect our country. With every passing moment, the regime is bringing you, the noble Persian people, closer to the abyss. The vast majority of Iranians know their regime doesn't care a whit about them. If it did care, if it cared about you, it would stop wasting billions of dollars on futile wars across the Middle East. It would start improving your lives. Imagine if all the vast money the regime wasted on nuclear weapons and foreign wars were invested in your children's education and improving your health care, in building your nation's infrastructure, water, sewage, all the other things that you need. Imagine that.
It's got war on terror vibes, hasn't it, Ash? Where you've got sort of a leader who's saying, I'm going to go to war with your government and it's in your best interest. I'm here to help you.
Well, absolutely. And we saw how that one worked out, because while there is, of course, opposition to the regime in Iran, just as there was opposition to the Taliban, there is one advantage that the Taliban in Afghanistan and the regime in Iran have over Israel, which is it's not a American-backed foreign actor leveraging the threat of dropping thousands of tons of bombs on you. There's never been an occasion, throughout history, really, where people go, "Yay! I'm so glad to be bombed by you." Like that doesn't happen. What you might have is a scale of destruction, which, as you mentioned, Michael, is so big and so devastating that it breaks people's spirit. But I think we're in a different situation here. There was one thing that I wanted to to say and suggest to our audience to read up on, which is you talked about that vision of permanent war in Israel's view, right, is actually advantageous to pursue a strategy of permanent war. No need to negotiate, no need to actually pursue a two-state settlement. I'd really recommend that our audience goes and reads an essay from the 1920s by one of the pioneers of the Zionist movement called Zev Jabotinsky, and I'm sorry if I've completely mangled it. This essay is called The Iron Wall. And it spells out in a very, very clear-eyed way, okay, the Zionist project is a settler colonial project. There has been no native population in history which has not resisted its own colonization. That's as natural for Arabs to do as anyone else. Our response to that is we are going to build an iron wall. It's all about amassing the advantage of arms and military superiority, and then negotiations can take place only if all resistance is broken, because Israel has militarily dominated all of its opponents. You had Zionists saying that as early as the 1920s, before the establishment of the State of Israel. So when we're talking about long-term plans and long-term visions, it's actually something like the Oslo Accords, which is the real blip in Israeli history and in Israeli political thinking.
A milestone has been set today as the UK's last remaining coal power plant has shut down. The closure of the power plant at Ratcliffe-on-Soar in Nottinghamshire marks the end of Britain's 142-year history of coal power use. It has been hailed by environmental campaigners as a victory for the government in cutting carbon emissions and displaying climate leadership. Ratcliffe, which opened in 1967, was meant to close in late 2022, but gas shortages triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine meant it continued to operate. So, is this finally some good news on climate? Joining me now is Simon Lewis, Professor of Global Change Science at UCL. Simon, should we be getting the champagne out?
Well, I'm not sure we should be getting the champagne out. There's a long way to go in terms of getting emissions down to zero, but it's definitely a landmark moment that a G7 country has ended the use of the dirtiest fossil fuel in producing electricity.
I suppose put this in sort of international context. Are we the first country to move away from coal, or the first sort of large country to move away from coal? How do we sort of think about this on a global level?
The first G7 country, so first large country. We're not the first country that had a reasonable amount of coal to get out of it. That was Portugal, and there's a few others that had very little coal and have got rid of it. But, to put this in context, the first coal-fired power station in the world was built in London in 1882. And since then, they've burnt over 4 billion tons of coal, over 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's been an enormous, shift to this source of emissions, and then this kind of decline down, and the last coal-fired power station being shut today. It's been a long decline over sort of 15 years or so, but it's definitely an important moment.
And coal, of course, drove our industrial revolution. Many countries in the world now have coal sort of still driving their industrial revolutions. And as far as I understand it, electricity generated by coal is at its highest it's ever been in history, mainly driven by Asian countries, including obviously China and India. On a global level, are we still going in the wrong direction when it comes to burning coal, or is there sort of seeds of hope there as well?
Well, there's sort of two seeds of hope. One is that emissions globally from all sources of fossil fuels have kind of more or less plateaued in 2023, 2024. And that's been driven by China getting out of coal. Not in a massive way, but it's mainly that their additional electricity use is coming from renewables. So that massive investment in renewables is starting to pay off. And for most places in the world, now renewables are the cheapest form of electricity production. The question is, you've got these old coal-fired power stations already built, and therefore they're being used. And that's what the policy needs to turn to, is to how to get those shut down in a managed and with a just transition for those workers way, and then move to renewables.
And I suppose it's sort of seeming quite, unsurprising now that we've seen the end of coal, because it's been sort of on the horizon for a little while in the UK. This wasn't inevitable in 2008. I know you were at the climate camp in Kingsnorth to try and stop one of a new generation of coal power plants being built. I was there myself, actually. I'm not sure if we had any conversations at the time, a long time ago. What happened there? What changed between 2008, when the government had an active plan to build out a whole new generation of coal power plants, and now, when coal is now a thing of the past in this country?
When the very old coal-fired power stations were coming offline, and there was a need to build some new capacity, then the fossil fuel industry said, well, we'll just build some new coal-fired power stations. And yes, climate change is a problem, and we will build special technology, carbon capture and storage, to take the emissions and safely bury them underground. And we'll do that sometime in the future. Just let us build the coal-fired power stations now. And there was actually a very big movement running from, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, even the scientists at the Royal Society, signed a letter to say this really shouldn't happen. Climate change is important. And then there was a big kind of pivotal moment when thousands of people, yourself and myself included, camped outside the proposed site of this first new coal-fired power station at Kingsnorth in Kent. And it kind of sent things higher up the agenda. And I think two things happened, as well as that surge in concern and saying that this was a live political issue that lots of people cared about, was the 2008 Climate Change Act, brought in by the Labour government, Ed Miliband, and we have 5-year carbon budgets that have to reduce over time. So there was a kind of legislative drive to take this on. And then the coalition government also had a couple of sets of regulations come in to make coal more expensive and harder to invest in and get a return on that investment. And as then renewables decreased in price, then we saw coal being squeezed out and more renewables installed.
And I want to play devil's advocate, especially because I like being critical of my past self. I'm not sure if I believe what I'm about to say, but let me put this scenario to you. So morally, of course, Britain has an absolute responsibility to dramatically reduce our emissions. But globally, what is really making the difference now, just if you're looking at the numbers, is development, especially in Asia. Poorer countries want to develop. If coal is all they've got, if that's sort of the cheapest thing they're going for, they're going to use it. Would it have been helpful if rich firms in Britain had, for the last 15 years, been investing loads of money and desperately trying to improve carbon capture and storage, so that then we could have exported that technology to China and India?
No, in a word, because the investment is to get the cost of renewables down, so that's what's built. And that's already happened in most places in the world. It's the cheapest form of electricity to install now. The issue is that you have an incumbent industry. The fossil fuel industry is the most powerful lobbying organization probably ever in the history of the world. If you think back to going to war in Iraq, pretty much agreed that we wouldn't have done that if they didn't have huge amounts of oil. And these incumbent industries are incredibly powerful about hanging on. And that's what happened in terms of UK electricity production. Yes, we won the battle on coal, but they actually built a series of gas-fired power stations, which of course have led to incredible bills for people, because we're relying on these volatile markets for gas, instead of jumping straight to renewables and getting all those benefits straight away. And we have this predatory delay from the fossil fuel industry, and that's what keeps happening, and that's what's playing out in Asia now.
I mean, is it so? Because on I'm not an expert on energy systems, but as far as I understand it, wind, solar is the cheapest, sort of when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. and when it's shining or blowing in the right place, put it like that. But it does have an intermittency problem, which is why many sort of rich countries are having a sort of renewed look at nuclear, because they say sort of when the conditions are favorable, yes, let's get most of our energy from solar and wind, but we also do need to have some backup capacity. By the way, this is also why China is still investing in coal power plants, even though it's also massively investing in renewables, because it wants that, let's say, that sort of that backup power, essentially. I think that might be the words they use. So is that not the case? And isn't that where sort of something like carbon capture and storage would have been useful?
So for electricity production, you're right that obviously there's intermittency. When the wind's not blowing, you have less power, and you either need storage options or you need some other source of supply. But I don't think that really that shouldn't be used as an argument for carbon capture and storage in this sense, because the broader you have your renewables capacity spread out. So if you have it in both, the North Sea and on the Atlantic coast in the UK, then it's rare that it's not windy in all of those locations at the same time. Plus, we're now starting to have more kind of smart grids. And as, for example, more and more electric cars come on board, then that's a series of batteries that can store energy and could also supply it the other way. In times of need. And we'll just balance supply by having cheaper electricity when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and more expensive electricity when those two things are not happening. And I think that's what's going to come in the future. You'll start to see very, very cheap electricity at certain times and more expensive electricity at other times to try and balance the load.
Simon Lewis, thank you for reassuring me that when I went camping by a coal power station in 2008, I was indeed right. I will sleep easier tonight. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Is Kemi Badenoch torpedoing her own leadership campaign? The four candidates for Tory leader are trying to make an impression on members at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. Very strange bunch of people to try and make an impression on, I'm sure. Badenoch is coming under fire for these comments made over the weekend.
What about things like maternity pay? I mean, we have one of the lowest rates in the OECD of maternity pay in this country. Changing that would probably help people make better decisions around family. Do you think we've got the right level of maternity pay at the moment?
So maternity pay varies depending on who you work for, but it is a function, where it's statutory maternity pay, it is a function of tax. Tax comes from people who are working. We're taking from one group of people and giving to another. This, in my view, is excessive. Businesses are closing. Businesses are not starting in the UK because they say that the burden of regulation is too high.
So maternity pay is excessive.
I think it's gone too far the other way in terms of general business regulation. We need to allow businesses, especially small businesses, to make more of their own decisions. The exact amount of maternity pay, in my view, is neither here nor there. We need to make sure that we are creating an environment where people can work and people can have more freedom to make their individual decisions.
Well, it's here nor there for people who can't afford to have a baby, isn't it?
We need to have more personal responsibility. There was a time when there wasn't any maternity pay and people were having more babies. We need to make sure.
Well, that's because women often had to not work. They had to stay at home. So is that the solution?
You're putting words in my mouth. The point I'm making, Kate, is that we have got to a point where government isn't working anymore and it's tinkering everywhere. Me giving you an exact amount of what maternity pay should be when circumstances are different everywhere is not where we're starting from.
Statutory maternity pay.
It's not where I'm starting from in this campaign. I'm talking about principles.
So strange, right? She's saying we need less business regulation. Then the host is saying, what about maternity pay? And instead of saying, no, of course, maternity pay, we need that, right? I don't think anyone in this campaign is disagreeing with maternity pay. She says, we need less regulations. Maternity pay is people working, subsidizing people who are pregnant. Like, well, yes, that's good. We need that. Right, there is a declining population. The idea that now would be a time, or a declining birth rate. The population isn't yet declining because of immigration, but there is a declining birth rate. The idea that now we would say, let's cut maternity pay so people can take some personal responsibility. By the way, they had loads of babies in the 1950s, even though they didn't have maternity pay. Well, guess what? They also didn't have jobs. Really strange. She's a strange person who makes strange arguments. She doesn't seem to have a particularly good political antennae. Badenoch's leadership rivals have criticised her remarks, but here's how she defended herself today.
Do you regret your comments about maternity pay yesterday? I don't regret things that I didn't say, but thank you for asking. I said maternity pay is important. If we want to fix maternity pay, we need to start with making sure that government isn't intervening in business excessively. Businesses can then pay more.
Do you think your comments have been misinterpreted?
Of course they of course they have. There was a long interview, but if you're taking 30-second clips, it's very easy to misinterpret. But one of the things that I'm not going to let happen is allow other people to say things that I haven't said.
I mean, she did say that, well, there's too many regulations on business. And then the host, which is, as a host is wont to do, said, well, what about this regulation that people like maternity pay? And she didn't say, of course, I like maternity pay. She said, look, maternity pay is a regulation on business. It's people subsidizing people having babies. Right? She never. There was never a sentence in that, I want to cut maternity pay or I want to get rid of maternity pay. But you could, all of her sentences were not particularly pro maternity pay, right? She was saying the need rest regulation, and when it was put to her, what about maternity pay? She says, yes, that does fall within that argument. According to the 2024 unauthorised biography of Badenoch by Tory peer Michael Ashcroft, Badenoch actually chose not to take maternity leave from the Spectator magazine, so potentially putting her money where her mouth is, although I don't know if this necessarily speaks well to sort of her policy instincts. Former Spectator editor Fraser Nelson is quoted in that book as saying this: having discovered she was pregnant, she told me she thought it would be unfair to ask us to keep her job open while she was on maternity leave. So she resigned to have her baby. She would have been within her rights not to have done that. As an employer, I really appreciated it. We're a small company. We'd have struggled to find someone decent to fill her post as stand-in digital chief while she was on maternity leave. It was an unusual thing to do. She did it out of loyalty to the magazine and moreover out of a sense of decency, I think. Obviously, up to her what to do. Her employer was grateful for it. Fabulous, whatever. But if she thinks the decent thing to do when you get pregnant is quit your job so that you don't get maternity pay, then maybe we've got some problems. Of course, also, it goes without saying, most prospective parents cannot afford to just quit their job to help their employers out. Badenoch has previously been described as able to, quote, start a fight in an empty room, and her critics in the party say that her comments show why she's unfit to be leader, that she's too easily misinterpreted or gets into too many unnecessary rows. But her backers believe her ability to speak more freely than others means that she'll cut through, or as so many conservatives desire, to say the unsayable. And so here's another statement from her this weekend, writing in The Telegraph this time. She says, we cannot be naive and assume immigrants will automatically abandon ancestral ethnic hostilities at the border, or that all cultures are equally valid. They are not. I am struck, for example, by the number of recent immigrants to the UK who hate Israel. That sentiment has no place here. On Sky, Badenoch was quizzed on those remarks.
You say, I am struck, for example, by the number of recent immigrants to the UK who hate Israel. That sentiment has no place here. Which immigrants are we talking about?
Well, people who come from countries where Israel is seen as an enemy. I remember growing up in Nigeria as a young child that people talked about Israel with a lot of positivity. What I didn't know is that in the northern part of the country, which was heavily Muslim, people spoke in a completely different way. And I also remember 10 years ago when 300 girls were stolen from school and taken away by Islamist terrorists. It resonates with what happened on October 7th. And so I'm always shocked by the number of people who are unable to sympathize with those victims, people who are ripping down posters. I think that's extraordinary. Missing children's posters being ripped down because people hate the country. I don't think that has any place here.
It's interesting. You make a virtue of your plain speaking and so on, but you evidently mean, when you say the number of recent immigrants who hate Israel, you evidently mean Muslim immigrants. Why didn't you just say that?
Because it's not all Muslim immigrants. And this is what I don't do. I'm very careful when I speak. I've met many Muslim people who love Israel. I met them in the Middle East. When I went to Saudi, when I went to the UAE, you look at the Abraham Accords, there are many people in the Middle East who want to support Israel. I remember reading, after this assassination of the Hezbollah leader, loads of people from Arab countries who were actually very pleased. That man caused chaos in Syria. So it is not all Muslims, but there are some, those who buy into Islamist ideology, political Islam, they do not like Israel.
Can you imagine if we have as a condition of coming into the country that you like Israel? right? It seems to be suggesting you're allowed, Muslims are allowed, but only if they love Israel. It's a strange thing to argue for, right? We love the Jews as long as they eat pork, right? It's not obviously, it's not a perfect comparison there, but it is the case, obviously, for obvious reasons, that most people in Arab countries don't really like Israel very much because they've been ethnically cleansing Arab people for the last 80 odd years, right? It's not a surprise. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they're bigoted. In fact, I think having a general dislike of Israeli government practices is a good thing, right? I don't think that should count against you on the are you welcome in this country. Another Tory leadership hopeful displaying his pro-Israel credentials is Robert Jenrick. He appeared today at a Conservative Friends of Israel event in a black hoodie with the slogan, "Hamas are terrorists." It was in green, white, and red, the colours of the Palestinian flag. He's also been spotted wearing it while jogging around London. Here's what he had to say at that event today. "I want this country to be the most welcoming country in the world for Israelis and for the Jewish community. And a small thing that I fought for when I was the immigration minister was to ensure that every Israeli citizen could enter our country through the E-gate, through the easy access, so that every airport and point of entry to our great country, there is the Star of David. There is a symbol that we support Israel. We stand with Israel." Ash, Britain's new border policy seems to be having a Star of David above the passport gate, and asking people to pledge that they really like Israel if they look a little bit Muslim.
I actually think that doesn't go far enough, Michael. I think that saying that Israeli citizens can use the e-passport gate doesn't go far enough, because it doesn't distinguish between those Israelis who shamefully have been against their government's ongoing occupation and those who've actually put the work in to commit war crimes in Gaza. So I would go further and say speedy boarding for Israeli war criminals, you know? Just help them get on holiday that little bit faster. I found it really funny listening to Kemi Badenoch talk, because it's a stupid person's idea of what a smart person would say. So she's like, actually, you're not going to get me on being Islamophobic, because I've been to the Middle East and I've met Muslims that love Israel in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who have basically dictatorships which, against the grain of popular opinion in the Arab world, embarked on a process of normalization with Israel, which then got completely scuppered by October 7th and the sort of reignition of the Palestine issue in the hearts of Muslims across the Middle East. And then when she was like, there's a difference between, Muslims who love Israel and political Islam. And I was like, wait a minute, are you saying that what's in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates isn't political Islam? Like none of these things make sense. And so that's why, obviously the things that Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch are coming out with are, I think very hateful. I think they're coming out with a series of ever more hateful and also unrepresentative of the wider electorate ideas, so that they can appeal to, the 10 geriatric headbangers who are still Tory party members. But there's a humor to it and an absurdity that I can't get over. I mean, can you imagine wearing a hoodie saying Hamas are terrorists and going jogging? It just sort of, it seems to me that in his ideal world, someone would like come up to him and say something really horrible, or even try and commit an act of violence. Then he could be a big martyr about it. Do you know what I mean? But it's even funnier that no one's reacting. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the best vengeance you can have, is just be like, you fucking weirdo.
If you say something to Jenrick while he's wearing his Hamas terrorist jumpers and then he does end up getting into power, maybe they'll sort of write your name down and deport you 5 years down the line. Again, if you look a bit Muslim, probably that does seem to be the distinction here. It's so funny as well when, fair enough, Trevor Phillips is right. You're talking about Muslims, aren't you? She's like, not all Muslims. I met a nice guy in Saudi Arabia. He loved Israel. Speeches from Badenoch, Jenrick, James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat will take place on Wednesday, so we'll hear more about their vision for the party. Then next week, the 4 candidates will face 2 rounds of voting among MPs until only 2 candidates remain. Then the vote passes to Conservative Party members, who In case anyone's forgotten, elected Liz Truss. If Badenoch is not knocked out in the 2 votes by Tory MPs, polling of party members shows that she is very likely to become the next leader of the Conservative Party. Ash, who do you think Labour want as their opposition leader?
I mean, it's a tough one because, like, who can say what Labour's strategy is at the moment? I'd say that Labour are maybe thinking a bit about losing votes to Reform, but also with all the freebie stuff, I can't say they're taking it that seriously. I think maybe they'd be all right with going up against Kemi Badenoch, because the thing is, there's nothing much between her in terms of Robert Jenrick and her in terms of headbangingness, but she gets very tetchy. But then so does Keir Starmer, so maybe they could just get tetchy together.
My opinion is that Robert Jenrick seems to be a bit more laser focused on the culture wars, right? So he talks a lot about immigration, I think lots of the Hamas are terrorists is basically trying to spark a conversation about Islamism and a bit of a dog whistle about British Muslims. I think that's what he's getting at. I don't know how much he actually gives a shit about Israel. I've got no idea. Maybe he really does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. But Badenoch seems to have more of a proclivity to start these debates in areas that, it's not a wedge issue where anyone is on her side. Like, why the hell would you start a debate about whether or not maternity pay is a good thing in like modern Britain right now? Because you can see with Jenrick, I think he's very objectionable. I think lots of the things he says are horrible and divisive, but they're divisive in a way where he has got, a reasonable proportion of the population on his side. Whereas with Kemi Badenoch, she seems so scattergun with sort of like the rows she will start, that I think Labour probably would enjoy that, actually. Ash, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if it was listening to Kemi Badenoch, but I now have heartburn. Is that normal?
I've got acid reflux after that. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.